Due to the coronavirus pandemic, virtually every movie slated for release from March until present day has been pushed back to accommodate the pandemic. One of the few to not do this, however, was Trolls World Tour, which was too far along in its merchandising and marketing to really be able to do this. So instead, they released it on streaming platforms. Universal stated that they were going to do this for the foreseeable future, and theaters pushed back by saying they will no longer screen Universal movies. Will this be overturned somehow? Almost definitely. But what I find interesting is that many people are not talking about how this isn't the first time this has happened. Universal has done this before, way back in 1983 with a little-known movie called The Pirates of Penzance. Pirates of Penzance is based on a Gilbert and Sullivan musical, which first was staged in the year 1880. There have been many adaptations for both stage and screen over the years. However, the play got a major overhaul by Joseph Papp in 1981. This isn't the point of the video, so I won't go into it here, but he changed lyrics and lines to make it both more adventurous and more comedic. The play was a huge hit on Broadway, winning Tonys for Best Revival, Best Direction, and Best Lead Actor for Kevin Kline. It was such a huge hit that only a few years later, in 1983, it was adapted from stage to screen more or less one-to-one, the one big change being Angela Lansbury being recast as Ruth. The rest of the cast stayed the same. To be clear, it was such a hit that a parody of it was released as a movie in 1982, just a year after the play's debut. Theaters have had a tight control on film distribution since their inception. After all, until the 1950s, it was literally the only way to see a movie. And even though films have been shown on television since the beginning of TV, there's never been enough money in first-run distribution on TV to really be a serious threat to the film-going experience. Similarly, with the advent of Betamax in 1975 and VHS in 1976, there was another avenue to release these films. But studios shied away from this. Major studios did not hop onto these two or Laserdisc until the end of the 70s. Most just did not believe that there was a profitable way of making money. The overhead for VHS tapes was enormous. In 1975, a VHS player would have cost $1,400, which is $6,700 in 2020 money. On top of that, a VHS itself was $90, which would be $430 in today's money. This meant VHS rentals was the main way people saw movies, and you just cannot make first-run distribution money on video rental stores gambling that people will rent the movie enough for them to make a profit. All this to say, films never really found a way of distributing to individual people besides movie theaters. That is, until the 1980s, with the advent of the admittedly self-explanatory pay-per-view. This all leads us to Select TV. Select TV was a pay-per-view service that was first launched in 1978. While pay-per-view is still a thing today, it was the hot new thing in the early 80s, and the film industry was trying to find a way to use this to its advantage. Select TV would switch to satellite in 1981, and find themselves focusing more on film distribution rather than sports and television, which most pay-per-view stations did. They would screen the Oscar nominees of every year and show foreign films. However, one of their biggest moneymakers was showing Broadway productions. Broadway was seeing a rise in popularity at the time, especially in stage-to-screen adaptations. Annie, Grease, Hair, The Wiz, and more were all released around this time. Select TV was seeing a lot of success as well in broadcasting the tape versions of Broadway shows. So, Universal has a musical fully produced, a new medium of distribution, and musicals are what that new medium specializes in. It's kind of a no-brainer for Universal, so that's what they do. They released Pirates of Penzance to Select TV on February 18, 1983, the same night as its limited run in theaters, for $10 a household. It does pretty well, screening in around 2 million homes, so $20 million on a $12 million budget. Where Pirates of Penzance had flopped, however, was in the theater. What was supposed to be a wide release only was shown on 92 screens across America. Over 80% of the theaters had boycotted the movie. It ended its run with just a measly $695,000. The boycott had worked, and Universal quickly gave up on the model. So if Universal knew that it was going to be boycotted, why did they still try to do this? To quote Jerry Hartman, who at the time was the VP of Universal Pay Television, a job that I truly believe does not exist anymore. Pay-per-view was something that was coming, and it had to happen sooner or later. We decided, early last year, that we wanted to do it, and in looking at our lineup of pictures, we decided that Pirates of Penzance had the best chance of succeeding. Let's compare that to Jeff Shell, the current CEO of Universal, talking about Trolls World Tour. The majority of our movies, whether we like it or not, are being consumed at home. It's not realistic to assume that we're not going to change, that this part of the business isn't going to change, like all parts of the business are going to change. So, what makes Trolls World Tour different? Well, it's two things. First, the obvious, the pandemic. There aren't any numbers to point to show that its box office revenue was an abject failure by going streaming only. The second is changing tides. While, yes, Trolls World Tour is the first major studio film to make this sort of shift, it has been building to this for a while. First, indie films would release on DVD the same day. The first example I could find of this was the 2004 tiny British film titled EMR, and had its DVDs released the same day. Steven Soderbergh's 2005 film Bubble sold the DVDs for the film at the theater as you were leaving. He could only get the small theater chain Landmark Cinemas to sign up for this idea. Theaters at that time also boycotted him. Due to the Sony leaks, controversial comedy The Interview was forced to skip theatrical release and went to digital only. But this was more of a case of theaters not wanting to show the movie instead of boycotting it, so I'm not totally sure it applies here. This is around the same time, however, that indie movies would release on iTunes the same day that they release in theaters. Though these are mostly smaller movies, so the impact on the box office was never that significant. Finally, Netflix began distributing original movies with the intent to make Oscar plays in 2015, starting with Beasts of No Nation. Netflix gave the film the 1-week release in LA that the Oscars mandate, but pulled it after that. Basically, some studio was always going to do this. It just took a pandemic to push their hand. The relationship between theaters and studios has always been a turbulent one, and one of constant change. What's going to happen next is anyone's guess.